site, DMVPN, Flex VPN, all of those different flavors of VPNs that we have. The S-Auto, it is an automation exam. Okay, so from the perspective of Cisco security products, that's what the focus is for the S-Auto. And then the last one that you see in green, this has been recently introduced, and it is a very cool exam. Okay, it basically focuses on securing cloud access for users and endpoints. Okay, so it was released, I think this exam was released maybe about a couple of months ago. Okay, so it's a new exam. It is one of the concentration exams now that someone can take to be certified as CCNP Security. Okay, and when I say it's a very cool exam, it's because you get a lot of exposure to a lot of different technologies within this exam. Okay, you get to see cloud security architecture, user and device security, network and cloud security, application and data security. You have visibility and assurance pieces as well. Okay, so you will basically need to have experience in some of the very niche products if you have never worked with, for example, Cisco Tetheration or maybe Umbrella, okay, or maybe Cisco SD-WAN. When you integrate it with Umbrella, you do SASE and all of those things. Okay, so it's a very good exam. You won't find a lot of resources for it currently because it is fairly new. Okay, but I can see this becoming an exam which a lot of people try to appear for because you will get to learn a lot from it. Okay. So coming back to our focus for the module that we have, it's the 300-715 CISA exam. Okay. Now, if you have any experience, or if anyone has any experience with AAA, great. Okay, so the class is basically designed to cover everything right from the basics. Okay, so if you've never worked with AAA, if you don't know what Radius is, what TACAX is, how those things work, how those things go in with ISE in itself, okay, it's the class for you to enroll in. Okay, and the exam, it really deeps dive into ISE in very depth. So if you're going to see the domains on the left-hand side, so Cisco tests you on 7 domains: the architecture, deployment, policies, how do you create policies, authentication, authorization, how do you do all of those policies and everything. Web authentication and guest services, very important piece in real-world deployment as well as in exams. This and BYOD, okay? You're going to be asked a lot of questions around these. Profiling, endpoint compliance, and the last piece is your network access device administration, which is the TACAX part. And then some of the things that I have kind of tried to break them down and show you what do you actually learn from the class. Okay, you get to learn what are different node types, different roles, personas, how the licensing works. Okay, we'll be looking at 3.x version in the lab, which is kind of the latest version, being 3.2. So that's going to be the ISE chain that we will, software chain that we'll look at. How do you install certificates in ISE? Okay, so we'll see how do you work with Microsoft Certificate Authority, how the certificates work. Very important certificates from the perspective of ISE. Okay, so you get to see a lot of the PKI parts, CSRs, certificates, CRLs, all of those things. Identity sources, another important piece. How can you use the local database versus how do you integrate Active Directory with ISE to make use of the centralized database that an organization might have? How do you configure the end user clients? Okay, maybe Mac devices, iPhones, Androids, Windows devices, Linux devices. How do you configure those to talk AAA on the network? Okay, and then we'll discuss in much more detail what NADs are, network access devices. Okay, and how do the network access device groups work in ISE? We'll look at policy sets. How do you create policies for Auth C and Auth Z? Okay, so that's your authentication and authorization. The very important piece, 802.1x, how do you implement IEEE 802.1x for wired and wireless environments? You'll then see what the difference is between 802.1x and something called as MAC authentication bypass. Where will you use MAC authentication bypass in production environments, and why would you use it? Okay, what are the pros and cons to using MAP versus 802.1x, etc. For organizations that get a lot of guests, okay, for example, maybe you have airport lounges, coffee shops, etc. They provide internet access and everything to guests. How do you implement all of those things? Okay, when you go into a hotel, you try to connect to the Wi-Fi. They ask you for a username and password. You enter that, and you get internet access, right? How all of that happens, right? So we look at that through CWA, centralized web authentication, guest access, and we look at a variety of different portals that we have within ISE for that respect. We'll also look at profiling, how the profiling services work, how ISE can figure out whether you are using Windows 10 or whether a client is using Windows 10, whether they are using Windows 11, whether they are using maybe an Apple iPhone versus an Apple iPad. Okay, maybe your environment uses Xerox printers, right? How can ISE figure out that information and help you to impose policies based upon that? Okay, so all of that will be part of profiling. Profiling services, how do you do feeds, what feeds are, what are logical profiles, what are endpoint profiles. So we'll look at all of that. From an organization compliance perspective or an endpoint compliance perspective, which you see here as that sixth domain in here. Okay, so a posture assessment correlates directly to that. How can an organization make sure that any endpoint, any end user that is trying to connect to the network, it's compliant? It's compliant with the organization's InfoSec policy. Okay, so for that, you can implement posturing or posture assessment within ISE. And we look at it, how you do it by using another Cisco security product. Okay, so if you have experience with Cisco VPNs, remote access VPNs, you would know what AnyConnect is. Okay, it's basically a client. Okay, a very lightweight modular client that you can use for VPN. But in addition to being used as VPN or for VPN, it can be used for a lot of different things. And some of the things we'll look at within the ISE training, right? So one of the things would be we can use AnyConnect to configure our AAA clients. Okay, it can be used for telemetry. In this case, it can be used for posture assessment as well. Okay, so we'll look variety of different ways of how you do posturing. Okay, so you have client-based, which you see here. You have client-less posturing, where no client is required to do the endpoint compliance. Okay, you then have something that we call as a temporal agent, okay, which temporarily gets installed on the end user. It does what it needs to do, and then it uninstalls itself. Okay, so there is no user intervention that is required for the install and uninstall. Okay, so it's a lot of different cool things that that can be done. And in addition to being cool, posturing is also one of the more complex things within ISE. Okay. Then we'll also see how you can manage your router accesses, switch accesses, WLC, load balancer accesses through ISE, okay, by using TACAX+. So we look at how ISE can act as a TACAX server for device administration. And then the last piece that we will look at from the ISE's perspective is how you implement Cisco TrustSec or CTS. Okay, so if anyone here has some knowledge about Cisco SD Access or Cisco SDA, okay, they would know what TrustSec is. But if you don't know, TrustSec is just a high level, very high level thing. Is TrustSec is Cisco's way of doing micro and macro segmentation on the network. Okay, so traditionally you make use of VLANs, you make use of access lists to do access, to do segmentation. Typically, you use VLANs. Okay, Cisco figured out a way to not use VLANs. Okay, because they're not very scalable. Okay, so Cisco figured out a way to not use VLANs, but still be able to do segmentation on the network. Okay, so for that purpose, you have TrustSec. And when you integrate ISE with something like within Cisco's DNA architecture, when you integrate it with something like Cisco DNAC, okay, when you're trying to implement an SD access fabric, you do TrustSec by default. But if you don't have DNAC, like we won't have in our lab as well, because we're just trying to understand ISE, you can still implement TrustSec, okay? So TrustSec, SGTs, security group tags, that's another way, or that's another form for VLANs, okay? They're not entirely VLANs, but they kind of work like VLANs to do the segmentation, okay? And then the SG ACLs, the security group ACLs. They're very similar to your regular ACLs, but they're still different, okay? So that's what we'll end the class with. So with respect to ISE, let me just say that it's not an easy product, okay? But that should not discourage you, okay? Once you learn, once you understand what it does and how it does those things, you will kind of appreciate the complexity and whatever ISE can do on the network and how it can help an organization or an environment. Okay. Any questions with respect to any of the topics, any of the domains? Any clarification required? Okay. So just a little slide that I had, nothing too complicated there. I would, however, want to show you the actual certification piece. So let's come in here to Cisco's website. Okay, let's review the exam topics. And just to show you how deep Cisco tests you and how deep of a knowledge they want from you from these topics, okay? So the way to go through Cisco's topics here, okay? Anytime you see a describe, right, you just need to know what that thing does, right? So you typically won't be asked any configuration, any troubleshooting related questions for that. Okay, so describe, think of it, it's just like a theoretical piece that they want you to understand. Okay. When you would want to know how do you configure something, okay, is if you see the keyword configure. Right. So for example, in this first domain here, they basically want you to be able to configure ISE personas. Okay, and what they are, we'll cover during the training what the personas are, how do you configure them, make sure. Okay, but they want you to understand what would be the different hardware and virtual machine requirements for implementing ISE. Okay, what would be the different deployment options? They obviously they would not want you to do some sort of a deployment in the exam. They just want you to understand. Okay, similarly, they would want you to understand how ZTP works for ISE. Okay, zero touch provisioning. And on the right hand side, you would see the percentage. Okay, so what would be the percentage of questions or weightage of a particular domain within the exam? Okay, so we're going to see the highest weightage is 25% for policy enforcement. Okay, because this is a very critical piece within the within ISE. And if you're going to see here, you see a lot of configures, implement. Okay, so for those, you basically should know if there are some commands that are there. You should know the commands. You should know show outputs. You should know debug outputs. Okay, because you could be asked questions around that, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of these things during the class, right? What's Active Directory? What are the different identity stores? Okay, what's 802.1x? We'll look at what IBNS is. Okay, so we'll specifically talk about IBNS version 1 and version 2 that you see here. What are the different modes? How do you implement MAB? What's Cisco TrustSec? How do you implement TrustSec? How do you configure, implement authentication and authorization policies or profiles? Within WebAuth guest access, you see everything is configured. Okay, so you basically need to know how you configure these features. Okay, so if I show you a screenshot for maybe a portal and there's some missing configuration, you should be able to figure out what's missing or why something is not working. Okay, so within these concentration exams, you would see a lot of configures and implements because Cisco really tests that particular product, that particular technology in a lot of depth. Okay, and we are getting some questions here. Okay, we keep going through those. Again, for profiling, you would need to know what profiler services is, what different profiling probes are. Okay, how do you do endpoint management? Okay, then this is a very important piece. We'll look at this throughout the training. What is COA, or change of authorization? Okay, or dynamic authorization. Then we have BYOD, very important in today's world. A lot of organizations, they allow users or employees to get their own devices. Okay, so BYOD is very important. Bring your own device. Okay, so so ISE plays a very important role with implementing and securing BYOD environments. Endpoint compliance, this is where posturing comes in. Okay, we'll discuss some of these keywords that you're seeing here: supplicants, supplicant options, authenticator server, authentication server, etc. And then the last piece will be TAGAX Plus, which will be used for device management and authorization. Okay, so there is a lot to cover in ISE. Okay, so when I'm taking CCNP Security, ISE typically takes the most amount of time. Okay, the highest amount of hours. So it easily takes 40, 50 hours plus. Okay, because there are lots of things that I cover. Okay, so if you're preparing for maybe any interviews, or maybe you're trying to get some assistance with, maybe you're trying to, or maybe you're managing an ISE environment at work and whatnot, or maybe you're just studying for CCNP Security. So I try to kind of cover most of everything that you would maybe will come across out there with respect to ISE. Okay, so it is one of the biggest classes that I kind of do in terms of the number of hours. All right, and everyone gets access to their own labs, right, where you're free to play with it. Okay, there are some restrictions, obviously, which cannot be done in the lab environment. For example, wireless. Okay, wireless cannot be virtualized, right? You cannot virtualize radio frequency. Okay, so that is a part which I typically don't cover, but I still go over the WLC part, right? I would still cover what is maybe an autonomous access point. Okay, how does it function with WLC? What are CAPVAP tunnels? Okay, how does WLC manage an access point? How does 802.1x work with respect to if you have, let's say, a switch, right? An Ethernet switch versus an access point for wireless. Okay, and I'll show you the WLC, the infra and everything. So we should be able to see that, but we won't be able to actually test wireless in the lab environment. Okay, but apart from that, all of the features that you see here being tested, being part of the modules, we'll be going over most of everything here. Okay, let's say about 90 to 95%. All right. Okay, stop for a couple of questions. if there are any questions anyone has. Ulrich has a question, is it part of cybersecurity also? Absolutely. So with respect to, I mean, what ISE does is ISE helps you to do identity management. Okay, so you might have heard the keyword identity and access management. Okay, IAM. So ISE helps you to do that.
Question, please, sir. So, how do we do lab, and like, do we need licenses to do the lab also?
So ISE, so with ISE, you have 90 days of evaluation period. Okay, so there's no requirement for you to have licenses. So once those 90 days expire, you delete the node, rebuild a new node, and you're going to have 90 days. Okay, so in a calendar year, you would maybe have to, reinstall ISE maybe 4 times only. Okay, and there are no restrictions to any features with respect to what you can do and what you cannot do while you are on that evaluation period.
Understood. And then the VIOS switch that we have in EVNG, is that compatible with the ICE that we will be installing? Like, will it function 100%?
Not 100%. Okay, so when I say not 100%, there are some things that it cannot do, right? So for example, jumping a bit ahead, but when we do centralized web authentication or when we do guest access, the switches, they basically intercept an HTTPS request and redirect them to ISE. That is the part that the virtual switch cannot do. Okay, but we kind of do a workaround in the lab. We try to access the switch manually, try to copy the redirect URL and paste it in the end user, etc., which in production you would not need to do, okay, because the switch will do that automatically. So that is one feature only, okay, that I've come across that does not work one-to-one with respect to how it functions on a physical switch. Okay, apart from that, the VIOS or even the IOL switches, they work absolutely fine. Okay, in the recent CML release, the Cisco Modeling Lab release, okay, Cisco has come out with iOS XZ switches as well. Okay, currently they cannot do the AAA part, what we're trying to do. Okay, the 802.1x and everything. So currently it cannot do that, but maybe in the coming future, when we get newer releases for the iOS XZ IOL images, I'm pretty sure we might be able to do those things as well. Okay, and then Cisco has also released Catalyst 9000 virtual images as well. Okay, you won't be able to find them on the Cisco software download page though, but they are available within CML. So they're kind of still in that beta phase. Okay, but once those come out, a lot of the features which these IOL, VIOS images are not able to do with respect to AAA, those images should be able to do that. Okay, but in its current form, where we are at, I would say 90 to 95% of what you need to do, you can do it just with EVNG. Okay, you basically don't need to have anything else. Yes, you need hardware, you need access points and everything when you try to do the wireless piece. Okay, but apart from that, everything from a wired perspective, you can do as it is.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? So Aldrich has a question. Can we get e-certificate for attending? I think you do get an e-certificate when you finish the the actual course. Okay, so I would say for you to just get back to the support team. Okay, and they should be able to give you more information around that. All right. So what we'll do today is I'll just quickly talk about AAA. Okay. Linto has a question. CCNP, can we go directly or after completing CCNA? So previously, CCNA used to be a prerequisite for CCNP. It's no longer a prerequisite. Okay, so you can directly do the core exam for CCNP and then do one of the concentration exams, and you would be able to get your CCNP. Okay, but I typically recommend if you are new to the whole networking thing, I always recommend you to do CCNA first before you go into the CCNP. Okay, but yes, in its current form, you can directly do CCNP without any problems. All right. Okay, so we'll just talk about a little bit about AAA. Okay, what AAA is, right? So when you have these 3 A's, okay, the 3 A's, it's AAA is a framework. Okay, it stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. So my pen just stopped working, so I just have to use the mouse for today. Okay, so bear with me. Okay, so authentication, authorization, and accounting. That's what the 3 A's are. And AAA framework or AAA, it's basically utilized to intelligently control access to a network, to network resources, to any device, to any computer on the network, to enforce policies, and to do auditing. Okay, so all of these 3 combined processes, they're considered very effective in doing secure network access. Okay, so that's what your goal is, to have secure network access. And another thing that ISE helps you to achieve when it implements AAA is to do ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access. Okay, so what Zero Trust says is, or what Gartner says, or what the keyword really means is, any device, any user that is coming on the network, that's joining the network, could be wired, could be wireless, could be VPN. By default, you don't trust anything, no matter if that device or if that person is maybe a receptionist or maybe is the CEO. Okay, until and unless that device, that user authenticates, is authorized properly on the network, you effectively do not give any access to that user. Okay, and no exceptions. So without the network knowing who is trying to join, what it will try to do on the network, or what they might be authorized to do on the network, you basically give no access. Okay, so one of the pieces for ZTNA or Zero Trust Network Access is it helps you to implement, or ISE helps you to implement that as well. Okay, now coming back to the AAA piece. Now, what is authentication? Authentication is where you provide some sort of credentials to anyone, for example, okay, to determine if access will be allowed for a person, for a device on the network. And when I say credentials, credentials could be anything. Okay, it could be a username and password. Okay, so when I said credentials, I said username and password. So username and password both form a credential. If I just say username, username is not a credential. Username is just an identity. Okay, when you combine the username with the password, that's what becomes a credential. Okay, so if someone just gives me a username, I cannot authenticate him. Okay, I cannot determine if I should give him access or not. Okay, so username and password, it could be certificate. And when I say certificate, I basically talk about from the perspective of X509. Okay, it could be some sort of a biometric. It could be a fingerprint scan. It could be a face scan. It could be a retinal scan. Okay, it could be an iris scan. It could be anything. Okay, so these credentials, when a user or a device they present these credentials, they're basically checked against a database. All right, and if the credentials match, access is allowed. Right, so that's the authentication. Okay, it's very similar to maybe you are trying to, you try to log into to your banking website. Okay, before you can look at your account information, you're supposed to provide a username and password. Okay, in some cases, you would also need to provide some sort of a secondary authentication as well, which we typically call as a two-factor authentication or a multi-factor authentication. Okay, which would typically be some sort of an OTP that comes to your mobile device. Okay, so when you are doing all of that, you are in that authentication phase. Okay, the server, the system is trying to authenticate, is trying to make sure that you are allowed to have access to whatever you're trying to access. Okay, which in this case is a banking account. Okay, maybe a savings account or could be anything. Okay, the next part is authorization. Just because you were authenticated, okay, or just because your authentication was successful does not mean you would be successfully authorized as well. Okay, so if you log into your banking account or to your banking website and you put in your correct credentials, right, the authentication succeed, does not mean that you will be authorized to view the banking information for everyone. Okay, so once the authentication happens, the system determines what are you authorized for. And in that case, you would be only authorized to view the banking information or the account information for yourself, credit cards information for yourself, okay, any of your banking statements for yourself. If you have maybe taken some loans and everything, the only information that pertains to yourself, no one else. Okay, so the authorization piece, the second piece, this is what provides differentiated levels of access. Okay, it determines whether the user has the authority to access certain resources or try to view certain resources or not. Okay, so that's the second step. So always remember, just because an authentication succeeds does not mean the authorization will succeed as well. Okay, so you could have an authentication success, but you could have an authorization failure as well. Okay. Now the last piece here is the accounting. Okay, so when you log in to your banking account and everything, the time when you logged in, from where do you log in, what sort of a browser you used, what's your IP address was, etc. All of this information is typically being stored by the banking servers for accounting purposes, for auditing purposes, for keeping a trail of when users are logging in, how much time they're spending on the servers, etc. Okay, so the accounting, it's basically, let's just say, a measure of the resources a user consumes when he has been provided access. And like I said, it can include the amount of time or the resources that they have accessed, what all they did when they were on the system. Okay, so those are the 3 A's. That's your AAA, right? Now, to put things into perspective, um, let's just take a very similarly a banking kind of an example. So let's imagine you want to withdraw some money from a bank account. Okay, now in order to do that, your bank would need to verify who you are. Okay, so if I say I'm Arun, the bank would need to verify that I am indeed Arun. Okay, so in that case, I would need to provide my ID and some sort of a signature. So maybe I'm providing a check. Okay, so I would typically need to have my signature matched. Okay, or if I'm trying to withdraw money through an ATM, okay, I would need to put in a PIN. That's the authentication. Okay, so just because I put in my PIN correctly does not mean I would be authorized to withdraw, let's say 20,000 rupees. Okay, so after authenticating and proving to the bank that I am the correct owner of that bank account that I'm trying to access, the bank would need to verify what I can do. Okay, so for example, I might only be allowed to withdraw a certain amount of money. Okay, so if my account only has 10,000 bucks, I cannot withdraw 11,000 bucks. I'm not authorized to withdraw 11,000 bucks. Okay, so I am the correct owner, right? I verified myself, so my authentication was successful. But if I tell the teller or the ATM machine, hey, I need to withdraw 11,000 bucks, it won't authorize me to do that. Okay, because I'm not authorized to withdraw, or I'm authorized to withdraw only a certain amount of money. Okay, so that's the authorization piece. And whatever these transactions I'm doing, I'm withdrawing and everything, right? It gets updated to some sort of a statement and everything. Everything is being recorded and logged by the bank. They keep a record of all the transactions for financial, for auditing purposes, etc. That's the accounting part, or that's the accounting piece. Okay, so everywhere that you go in the environment throughout the world, you have AAA working in some form or the other. Okay, and that's going to be the basis for you to understand secure network access and ISE in general. Okay, because ISE is going to do the exact same thing. It's going to authenticate a user or a device. It is going to authorize, okay, look at its authorization policies and make sure that when you're trying to connect to maybe the wired, the wireless, or maybe the VPN network, it only authorizes you to access what you should be accessing, okay, and not giving you a permit IP any kind of an authorization. Okay, and then it's going to log everything that's happening, what device is connecting, from where it's connecting, what time it connected, what resources it's trying to access, okay, what authentication, authorization, username, bunch of different things. Okay, so it does the accounting piece or the logging piece as well. Okay, now from AAA's perspective, there are two types of AAAs. Okay, so one is device administration AAA. And the other one is network access AAA. Okay. So device admin or device administration is basically, let's say, an admin. He tries to SSH to a router or to a switch. Okay, you want to authenticate that, and you also want to authorize, maybe let's say what commands he's allowed to run. Maybe he's not allowed to go into the configure terminal. Maybe he's not allowed to run any show commands, but he's allowed to run any debug commands. Okay, so you can control all of that. That's why it's called device administration. Okay, so you're trying to access, do a console, a tailnet, or an SSH to a device, to a router, to a switch, to a load balancer, maybe to a firewall, etc., for management purposes, for managing the device. Okay, and you still want to control all of that. Okay, so you implement device administration AAA. The other piece is network access AAA. This is where your end users, end clients, their devices, they try to connect to the network through maybe a desk port or a switch port, through maybe wireless, or maybe they're coming over VPN, remote access VPN. Okay, so you implement AAA, or you can implement AAA for either of them or for both of them. Okay, they both run different protocols, or they both use different protocols. They both serve different purposes, like I highlighted. Okay, most of the focus during our training is going to be on network access AAA. Okay, let's say about 90-95%. Device administration AAA is just the 5% part of it. Okay, whatever features and everything that I've highlighted, the domains and everything. If you remember the last domain, okay, about 10% is for the network device administration, for the device administration part. Rest everything, it belongs to the category of network access AAA. Okay, and I'll just leave this here before we end it for today, and we'll continue it tomorrow. For device administration AAA, ISE makes use of TACACS plus. And why do we have that plus? I'll talk about that story as well. And then for network access AAA, you have radius. Okay, so I'm pretty sure a lot of you must have heard about these keywords. Okay, a lot of you might not know why it is there, why it's used for, what are these used for, but you might have heard about those two keywords. Okay, so TACACS Plus is used for device administration AAA. Radius is used for network access AAA. If you would be, or if you've ever worked in a service provider environment, okay, ISPs, they implement AAA as well. They call it diameter. Okay, so not something that we would talk about, but just something to, to throw it out there. So this is what training is going to be, or this course is typically is going to be about. Mostly it's going to talk about radius, and another thing that we will discuss is 802.1x. Okay, and I'll take a couple of questions here. Can we configure ISE on switch interface instead of port security? Not sure I understand that. You cannot configure ISE on a switch. Okay, you can configure a switch to talk to ISE. Okay, and you typically do it, yes, instead of port security. So you typically do not, or you cannot configure both port security and the radius part or 802.1x, when we'll understand it together. Okay, because when the switch interface or the switch port is being used for 802.1x, okay, it's any which way is secure. Okay, so there's no need for having port security on it. All right. I have another question. So Cisco ISE does radius service as well. Cisco ISE primarily does radius service. Okay, so there are only two services that it does, Radius and TACAX, along with a bunch of other things, but these are the main things. Okay, and you don't need to do any proxy or anything. Okay, Windows NPS is a completely different thing. Okay, so ISE in itself is self-made. Okay, so it can do everything related to Radius. Any other questions anyone has? All right. So we are okay. We have a couple of other questions as well. Okay. So last question: does it act as a CS server as well? It can act as a CS server. Okay, but for very specific purposes. So it does not replace, let's say, a public CA or maybe a Windows CA. Okay, but when you try to do BYOD, okay, it can act as a CA server as well. So we will be doing CCNA security first and then ISE. So that there is no CCNA security anymore. Okay, so that certification has been removed by Cisco long time ago. Okay, so this is not going to be covering the very basics of security and everything. Okay, I will be primarily talking about ISE. Okay, everything related to ISE, AAA. That's what we'll be discussing in this. All right. Under 5 minutes left. Any other questions? Bhim, you can discuss it with the team about the timing and everything. Okay, support team. So we would be having another hour tomorrow as well. I'll discuss a little bit more about TACAX, Radius, a little bit more. Okay, and maybe if you have any further questions, we can discuss those tomorrow as well. And then hopefully from next weekend we will be starting with the full-blown course. Okay, the full-blown class. Yes, Philip, it's going to be a weekend course. Feroz, yes, same time tomorrow. All right, 3 more minutes. Okay, if there are no more questions, then I'll give you guys your 3 minutes back. Okay, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Hope today's session was informative, right? So if you want to do some more research on the CCNP security and everything on ISE, if you have any questions or anything, let's talk those tomorrow. All right. Okay, thank you guys. See you tomorrow.